Greetings, one and all, and welcome to another episode of the Sitrep podcast, your forward operations base for all things military historical wargaming. I'm your host, Ariskany Jim, and today we are going back to the Ardennes Forest for another scenario set during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The system we are going to be using is Mark Ritchie's Tactical Combat, played in 15mm, and the scenario involves some of the very intense fighting that took place around a little Belgian village called Vith. Vith was one of several unfortunate Belgian villages that stood squarely in the advance path of Hassel van Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. Now, this wasn't actually supposed to be the main axis of the German advance according to the German plan. That was supposed to go a little bit further to the north in the sector controlled by Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army. But initial American defenses at places like Elsenborn Ridge really gummed up the works up there in Dietrich's sector, and so more and more Manteufel found that he had to take over responsibility for the main axis of the German advance. This made places like Vith suddenly extremely important. Some of the units that we're going to see in today's game include elements of the Führer Begleit Brigade. Now, people hear that word Begleit and they think this is some sort of an escort detachment, and it really was. But this is not the Leibstandarte. Now, 1st SS Leibstandarte was in the Battle of the Bulge. They're just a little bit elsewhere in the campaign area. Now, this particular brigade is attached kind of informally at first to Großdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division, which sounds kind of strange because Panzer Grenadier Großdeutschland is famous for being a division that once it went to the Eastern Front over there in Russia, it kind of never came back. And yet here we see powerful elements of that division in the West fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. Again, the Begleit Brigade began as an attachment to Großdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division, but effectively it was part of the division. They wore the same wrist cuffs, they had the same divisional insignia on their vehicles. It's pretty much Panzer Grenadier Großdeutschland. Another really interesting unit is Sturmgeschütz Brigade 200, originally a battalion-sized battalion formed under a guy by the name of Major Alfred Becker. As of February 1944, this had been upgraded to a brigade. But don't kid yourself, their authorized strength was still barely 30 Stugs, and again, that's what they were authorized. Lord only knows what they actually had. Some later sources are going to call this Schwere Panzerjäger Abteilung 673, but that doesn't come until February 1945. So yes, in the Battle of the Bulge, you have Sturmgeschütz Brigade 200, part of the Führer Begleit Brigade. How you have one brigade being part of the organizational order of battle of another brigade, well, welcome to German orders of battle, especially in the late war period. Now, as these formations and other units of 47th Panzer Corps, 5th Panzer Army were threatening Vith, the Americans were desperately trying to send reinforcements to that village to hold this position. This included Combat Command B of the 7th U.S. Armored Division, 7th Corps, 1st U.S. Army, under command of Brigadier General Bruce Cooper Clark. Now, they are pushing hard and fast down the Vilsam Road, trying to get to Vith in order to relieve the unfortunate remnants of the 106th U.S. Infantry. This is the Golden Lions Division that had just lost 2/3 of its strength when the Schnee-Eifel pocket collapsed earlier in the Battle of the Bulge. As they're heading west towards Vith, they find that the Germans have already begun to bypass the town from the north and are now coming down from the north to threaten these roads leading into the village. This kicks off a series of very intense battles along the northern shoulder of that road on 21st and 22nd December, especially around a small village west of Vith, sometimes called Roth, sometimes called Sarlay-Vith. Now, while the Americans would ultimately lose the overall Battle of Vith, 7th Armored had been able to keep enough of these escape paths open so that they, the 106th, and some other units would be able to execute a well-organized but nevertheless expeditious retreat out of Vith up to the northwest to rejoin elements of the 18th Airborne Corps that were trying to set up a new defense line further to the northwest. Now, on today's table, we have Steve and Ron playing Combat Command B of the 7th Armored. I've got Sturmgeschütz Brigade 200, and Mark's got the Führer Begleit Brigade. Will the Americans on today's gaming table have a little bit more luck with their defense than their counterparts did historically? Let's go to the footage and see what we find. Silence lies cold over the imminent battlefield. But in all seriousness, folks, here is our game table for today's scenario. It's an 8x6 table presented in 15mm. The camera is oriented correctly for a change, so we're looking out of the south into the north, And broadly speaking, what's going to happen here is the Germans are going to be coming out of the north, and they're trying to sever that paved road that we see extending from left to right. That is the Vith Road that CCB of 7th Armored Division is going to be trying to defend. You see here some of their units. They've got some M10 gun motor carriage tank destroyers, some M8 Greyhound armored cars, some M8 howitzer motor carriages. We've got some of Mark's awesome 50mm buildings here. This is the actual village of Sarlay-Saint-Vith that I'm actually going to be trying to take as commander of Sturmgeschütz Brigade 200. Some of those buildings are very, very tough. Mark's got different kinds of buildings in his system, obviously wooden and concrete, but then he's also got different levels of stone and brick and different kinds of construction. And some of them are going to be very, very tough to get through. Now, I do have the right firepower to do it. I have a Sturmhaubitze 42 with the 10.5 centimeter howitzer in my force. So I've got some good door knockers ready to go. Both sides also have access to offboard artillery, although it's variable, and the American artillery is much more... The American artillery is going to show up much more frequently, let's just put it that way, than the German artillery. But we still have some. The weather is still very overcast, nobody's got any air power, and again, it's going to come down to who holds that village and whether or not the Germans can cut that paved road. Here is my force for the day, the spearhead elements of Sturmgeschütz Brigade 200. You'll notice that those first 3 stugs are your standard stugs. That 4th one there has a shorter, thicker gun. That's my Sturmhaubitze 42, again with that 10.5 centimeter howitzer, the assault howitzer. Now those other stugs are great for taking out tanks, but that assault howitzer is what I'm really going to need to knock holes in these big buildings. That's going to be the main obstacle, at least over here on my side of the table. So my opponent for the day, Ron, is setting up his forces. He's going to have all kinds of hidden snipers, artillery spotters, anti-tank guns. Yeah, that village is going to be a very, very tough nut to crack, I don't mind saying. Again, I have some of the right tools for the job. It's just going to come down to whether or not I can keep those tools alive and going long enough for them to actually break down some of those buildings. Over here we have Mark's force. He's got some Panzerkampfwagen Mark IV Js with the screen Schürzen on the side. That's a great effect he's got there on his wash. Some semi-armored flak on an old Mark IV chassis. And, a lot of motorized infantry. He's going to have some Jagdpanzer IV 70s coming on the board later. Those are the longer 70 caliber, 7.5 centimeter anti-tank guns. I'm really looking forward to see what they can do against some Shermans. Turn 1 has been completed, and we are now beginning turn 2. So my stugs came on in turn 1, and then you saw those little purple react markers next to my stugs. That's them opening fire right at the outset of turn 2. He sort of blew the top off of that church tower there, took some sniper fire out of there. Here's another sniper hiding out in this building. I should say that tactical combat is predominantly an open book game, quote unquote. You're allowed to look in buildings and see what's deployed there. It's not always the most realistic when it comes to hidden deployment. However, it prevents table arguments. Also, in Mark's scenarios where there is hidden deployment, you don't put the figures on the table at all. You just record it on a map, and then they pop up when they actually open fire on someone. So again, my stugs have open fire here. Over here on my other wing, my supporting infantry is not doing so good. I've got American machine gun, rifle, and sniper fire coming down and hitting my infantry, including my leader. So my leader there is the guy with the little blue and purple dots. Yeah, that's seriously wounded counter isn't really on the right figure there. There we go. And you also see my medic right next to him trying to fix him. There's a role for that. I'm trying to bring my overall commander back into the battle there. I have taken some rifle fire at that 57mm anti-tank gun position, which I spotted once he opened fire on my poor little stugs. That ain't right. They didn't do anything to anybody except blow the top off of a church. And we're very soon going to go to work on the rest of those buildings. So, yeah, I've got some good overwatch positions. Let's see how I can develop this attack. Some more American tanks have shown up on the table. We see those Shermans creeping onto the board there. They are engaging with Mark's Panzer IVs and apparently shooting up his little reconnaissance detachment there. This poor little Schwimmwagen, and wow, is someone seriously swanning around the battlefield on a motorcycle with a sidecar? Come on, guys, this isn't an Indiana Jones movie. Meanwhile, Mark is going to try to provide some cross-table support with some long-range Mark IV tank fire against some M8 howitzer motor carriages that are lurking behind those buildings, waiting for me to open up my push. So the American M8 is basically a light tank, like an M3, with a 75mm assault howitzer on it. Not looking forward to that. But Mark might be able to take him out for me, but both of those shots, unfortunately for him and me, have missed. So better luck next time. My Stugs are now all on the move. So you see those green counters there, those are movement counters. And what my battery is basically doing here is advancing at sort of a half speed and firing from short halts. My Sturmgeschütz of 42 with a 10.5cm assault howitzer has been engaging that building and has now collapsed it. So Mark's got rules in his system for how different kinds of buildings collapse depending on their construction and of course the firepower of the weapon with which you hit it. And what I learned very quickly was if you really want to collapse a building, you've got to aim for the ground floor. Otherwise, upper floors may survive. Meanwhile, my other Stugs, armed with the 75mm L48s, basically the anti-tank guns, have been engaging these new American tank destroyers that are showing up. So they started off with M10s. In their reinforcement packages, they also had M36 Jackson gun motor carriages with very powerful guns, so I'm definitely keeping a very, very hard eye on those guys. Meanwhile, over here on Mark's side of the table, we have some Jagdpanzer IVs, the later variant with the L70 7.5cm anti-tank gun. So they look a little weird. However, again, that's an L70. It's the longer 70 caliber version of that gun. Long story short, take your first shot. It basically hits as hard as a Panther. It's generally speaking, put your knives away, Reddit counters. It's basically the same gun as a Panther. And it'll go through just about any Allied armor, including that Sherman Jumbo we see burning there at the very bottom of your screen. Note that is a Jumbo, not an Easy 8. So it's got the same 75mm gun as the earlier vanilla Shermans. However, it does have the extra armor plating in the front. Didn't help very much when hit by that very, very high velocity 7.5mm gun out of the Jagdpanzer IVs. Turn 5, and I've got no complaints. My Stugs have taken some hits, and I have lost a crewman, but by and large, I've won that initial gunnery duel against the American tank destroyers that really would have threatened my right wing as I moved over that open killing ground into the objective village. Still more American tanks are coming onto the table, but quite frankly, that's Mark's problem. Meanwhile, I am steadily winning the balance of fire as far as suppressing American counterfire coming back at me out of that village. You see where I've got this pretty good base of fire here on this northern ridge. Infantry and assault guns were pouring fire down south into the village. And those are the three buildings I really have to take, the ones that are enclosed by those roads there. I either have to demolish and occupy them or just occupy them, but quite frankly, it's going to be next to impossible to occupy them without demolishing them. So even though I'm more or less in charge of the actual game-winning objective, this is also really going to come down to whether or not Mark can win this tank battle over here on the western end of the table. Again, we're looking from north to south, so this is the west. If he doesn't, long story short, take your second shot. As soon as I move on that village, I'm going to have all kinds of problems crashing down on my right wing. More American armor has pulled up behind my village. These are M36 gun motor carriage tank destroyers armed with very powerful 90mm anti-tank guns. Not so happy about that. Taking a quick turret eye view, you can see where he's going to take a nice long-range shot right through the center of the village, past that monument, and hit the flank of some of my armor as I try to make my push into the village. Now you can see where I'm trying to screen my Stug with what I thought was a useless captured French half-track left over from the 1940 campaign. Germans were putting it to some kind of good use. Turns out that thing is loaded with a squad of priceless German assault pioneers. I thought it was empty. I wasn't really paying attention to my order of battle sheet. So thank Lady Luck that Steve missed that shot, because I thought I was being clever and sneaky by screening my Stug with a less valuable piece of armor. If I had lost that whole squad of pioneers, that wouldn't have been a good day. Meanwhile, you can see my other infantry squad and a Flak Panzer III, yes, 3, not the more familiar Wind mounted on a Mark IV chassis, making a push into the village. Meanwhile, here comes my half-track ambulance. He's just cruising down the front of my line like a Mardi Gras float, slinging out beads. As he drives down the line, he's just throwing out video game health packs to all my guys that have taken wounds. Hey, it's what's keeping my guys in the fight, and if it works, it works. Switching over to Mark's big tank battle here on the western end of the table, we can see where there's really a lot of very, very open terrain. This was a very nice little patch of ground on which to have a good old-fashioned tank dust-up. Now, obviously, I have been focused mostly on my end of the table, but taking a break to come over here and see what's going on, I'm pretty sure Mark has this tank battle more or less well in hand. Of course, the battle is ongoing, the game isn't over yet, and anything can happen, but the Americans don't really have a whole lot of firepower left with which to resist his advance. We see those 3 Shermans burning there at about lower right. One of them is a jumbo with all that extra frontal armor plating. Doesn't look like it helped him very much. To be fair, though, Mark has definitely taken, again, some pretty hard knocks himself. That half-track is burning, there's some more armor burning off the left hand of the screen you can't quite see. And that Mark IV with the red button on his nose, that is a gun knocked out. He can still use his coax, he can still use his bow machine gun, but that's pretty much it. The only real threat I had against my right wing were those 2 tank destroyers there. I took those out myself with my Stugs. However, Mark did, of course, help me out with some cross-table support, knocking out some of these M8 howitzer motor carriages I was facing here in the village. But all in all, I would still say the MVP is still on-board direct-fire howitzers. I've got that Stu 42 with a 10.5 centimeter. I've got a 15 centimeter self-propelled howitzer as well, and they have just been knocking on the walls of these big stone buildings to the point where Ron is honestly not really keen on occupying these objective buildings because he knows I'm just going to knock him down. The thing is, those are reinforced stone buildings. It's going to take a while. And if Ron is able to keep me from occupying those buildings for a certain number of turns, they can still walk away with a win. Into the movement phase of turn 8, and you can see here where my German infantry has finally reached the outskirts of the objective. Not insufficient strength, and by no means have we taken the objective or secured it, but let's just say the end zone is in sight. So here comes some more of my half-tracks as I continue my movement phase. Here is that god-awful French half-track that is loaded with German pioneers. I'm trying to get them to the base of that church to make sure that I can take that in relatively short order. That quad 20mm anti-aircraft tank there, that Mark III, again, it's kind of an experimental vehicle, has been keeping American infantry pretty well suppressed. That Stug has a knocked-out gun, but hey, he's still an armored vehicle with machine guns. Hell, he'll drive over somebody if nothing else. Clearly, we're down to using whatever we have left. So here's an old artillery spotter, that yellow dice, where I was dropping some off-board artillery, knocked out his platoon leader and lightly wounded one of his remaining snipers. Alright, let's take a look inside this church. Alright, those red poof balls are damaged, but there's no more infantry inside that church. Looks like Ron has got most of his infantry behind the church. Probably a cagey move, probably a pretty smart move, because he knows I'm just going to bombard that church. Now, it is a reinforced stone building, and I'm fresh out of tactical nukes. It's going to take me God knows how many turns to reduce that building to rubble and kill all the infantry inside. I'm going to have to assault it. Again, the Germans are on a clock. We don't have all day with which to assault this position. I'm being very careful, or at least I'm trying to, keep out of the central street lines of fire there, because there is a remaining Jackson down there. I'm trying to keep an eye on him. Now here's something I will admit I kind of screwed up. I was trying to keep an eye on that Sherman there you see at upper left. He can take a cross-table shot and hit me very easily. You can see he's got that left-hand Stug there, dead bang, because, yeah, that guy right there. Because I thought I misjudged the lines of sight. I was trying to keep overwatch with that Stug with the red casualty counter on him, but if you follow my finger there, you can see that the Overwatch Stug does not have line of sight on the Sherman, and the Sherman does have a line of sight, with the flank shot no less, on my Stug that's actually making the push toward the objective. So, not exactly the best move there. But Oop, put him on the outside there a little bit. My guys are all on double move now. We're just pretty much racing across that open ground. We're not pausing for firing. So in this game, you can pretty much move double. You can shoot and move. I'm not doing anything with shoot and move. I'm just literally hauling ass as best I can. Meanwhile, my ambulance here is going to try and push forward, and he'll eventually reach those infantry. You see all those wound markers, those red counters there. Mark is trying to send me some additional armor support, the half-track with a little anti-tank gun bolted on the back. And yeah, he's pushing forward with his little armor platoon here. And again, I'm pretty sure he's got things more or less wrapped up here on the western end of the table. That was at least my big concern, was that Mark was not going to win that battle. And when I made the push down that road toward the village, long story short, take your third shot, what was going to happen was I was going to wind up eating a big armored attack on my right wing. So fortunately, that never developed. And this is where our opponents are going to go ahead and concede the game. So Mark and I are going to go ahead and walk away with the laurels this time. Nevertheless, definitely a hard-fought game. Well done by both Steve and Ron, our honorably defeated opponents. At the same time, yeah, I think sometimes the luck was just a little bit on our side. I'm not going to lie. So well done by everybody, and yeah, that's the end of the game. All right, folks, there are our results. Despite some pretty tenacious defense and some great use of cover and concealment, especially in those heavy buildings in the village itself, looks like the Germans are going to walk away with a win on this one. We were able to cut that road leading into Vith, and what's going to wind up happening now in the broader operational context is that when the Americans begin the general withdrawal out of Vith, they're going to have less roads to work with, and it's going to be a much more difficult process. I won't say that I did particularly well against that fortified village, but Mark definitely did better in that tank battle that developed in the more open terrain extending out further to the east. I'll also admit that it was a lot of fun just knocking down some of those buildings in the village, whether or not there were American defenders in it or not. Mark's got some great mechanics for collapsing buildings in his game system, and I'll admit it was kind of a guilty pleasure just knocking down buildings and watching them collapse. But that's where we're going to leave it for today, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Please remember also to hit that notification bell. Also, please consider joining the Sitrep Podcast Discord. There is an auto-accept invitation to our Discord in the link of this description. Come by, check it out, see what the rest of the community is up to, and even better, show us what's going on your hobby table. So, to wrap this up, we are rounds complete for another episode. This is Risky Jim with the Sitrep Podcast, and as always, Tango Mike for watching.